Hey guys, in this video I'll be going over the 5 most important add-ons for Raiding and Mythic Plus, and I will also let you know how to set them up and some tips and tricks on how to get the most out of those add-ons. By the way, I'm also really close to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, so if you enjoy content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button. I would really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Alright, so we're talking about add-ons with WeakAuras and settings that you should be doing if you want to be better at Raiding and M+. Alright, number 1. WeakAuras. I mean, most people already use WeakAuras, right? Because it's kind of required for raiding. People say you need WeakAuras because blah, 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 right? But one thing that people don't do is like change the WeakAuras according to what they need. And I do think that is very important. And I understand it's a little bit intimidating because WeakAuras look very complicated, right? Like there's a lot of settings and a lot of things you can do with WeakAuras. First of all, I think you should have like a little bit of an order in your WeakAuras. You shouldn't just import like 20 different WeakAuras packs, and then you have some WeakAuras that you have triple, and then there's a sound, you don't know which WeakAuras it belongs to. Some of them are like off screen, others are covering a character, others are covering part of your UI, and so on. So it's very important that if you use WeakAuras, in my opinion, that you look through the WeakAuras that you are importing, that you know what all of them do. And I personally also suggest that you disable WeakAuras if you don't think you need them. Like, I think that only important WeakAuras, you should only have important WeakAuras that you actually care about, that are actually useful to you, because a lot of people have so many WeakAuras that your brain just stops registering them. Like, if every 2 seconds there's a WeakAuras that pops up somewhere on your screen and there's a million sounds and a million icons or whatever, your brain will just like ignore them. So sometimes you will die to a mechanic. It's like, oh, I didn't know I had this mechanic. And then you look back, if you have like a VOD or whatever, and you see, oh my god, there's like a WeakAuras in the middle of my screen, and I just didn't see it. And at that point, it's not even, of course it was your fault, but if you kind of condition your brain that there's like a million WeakAuras that pop up on your screen that are not important, then your brain will also ignore important WeakAuras, right? Because your brain eventually will be like, oh, there's a million WeakAuras, but they're not so important, so I'm just going to ignore them, right? So in my opinion, having WeakAuras that are not super important, you should remove those, especially if you're importing packs, which is fine. Obviously, making your own WeakAuras is difficult, and not everyone does that. And that's fine. You don't have to learn how to make your own WeakAuras. But learning how to like organize your WeakAuras and change them the way you want is very important. Otherwise, they're useless, right? So if you install a pack, like for example a raiding pack, like for example I have this huge like liquid WeakAuras where there's like a million WeakAuras, right? Now what you want to do, first of all, you want to have your anchors in a correct spot where you like them. Like usually these packs have something called, like it's a group that is called anchors. Like this one is for example called liquid anchors, and most WeakAuras nowadays have this. Let me explain what this does. So this group here that is called anchors will determine where your WeakAuras show up on your screen. So for example, here it says bars. So if I click on bars, this is all of the WeakAuras that are coded as a bar will be here, right? And you can move these around. What I recommend doing is that you open all of the anchors. So now I see where all my anchors are. Another important thing is to enable the rest of your UI to see if they're covering something and to see if they're actually in a position where they're not going to be covering the rest of your UI. So for example, my raid frames are down here. Like I know that if I'm in a raid, then here will be my raid frames, right? Because right now I could move the bars down here, right? Here there's nothing. It's like, oh, that's a great position. But then I'm in a raid and all of a sudden my raid frames are here and this is covering my raid frames. So you want to make sure that you know where the rest of your UI is, and you want to move it to that spot. What you can do is you open your raid add-on, whatever it may be. Like, I don't know if you use Bigwigs or DBM or if you use WeakAuras for it. I use Bigwigs, right? What you can do with Bigwigs and with DBM as well is you can create test bars, right? So you just create taskbars, or you can toggle the anchors on and off. So now I see, like, you can see my bars are here and here and here in the middle of my screen, right? So this is where my bigwigs is. So now you want to make sure that the anchors of the WeakAuras are not covering the other weak. Like I don't want to move this here, right? Because otherwise it's going to cover my bigwigs. So that is something you want to keep in mind as well. You want to keep in mind where your details is, where your map is going to be, where your player frame, where your boss frame is as well. That's something you can also enable depending on which unit frames you use. I use shadowed unit frames. You can unlock the frames so you see where they are. So now I know this is where my boss frame is, this is where my focus frame is. And now I look at anchors again. And now I see, okay, well, this is covering my focus frame, right? And this WeakAura is, it's close to my boss frame. I don't want it to be covered, right? So now that you have all of these like anchors enabled, you can now see where your free space is. And then you move them around accordingly. So that's one thing you can do. Outside of deleting WeakAuras that you don't want, of course. Some people, like when it comes to deleting WeakAuras, some people don't know like what a certain WeakAura is, right? Like let's say you want to do Siskarn, right? And then you look at all of these WeakAuras here. And then you're like, tactical destruction, what is that? Like, I don't even know what that is. Do I need this? Do I not need this? Well, the best way to understand what it is, if you want to be looking at everything individually, is by just going, either you can go to the dungeon journal and just go to the boss and see what this ability is. You can also just look it up at Wowhat. Another thing that people don't always know what to do is if you go to a WeakAura, every spell, every buff, every debuff has a spell ID. And if you don't find the name somewhere, because sometimes it says a word like blast wave, whatever, and then you do not find that ability in the dungeon journal. So what do you do now? How do you know what this ability is? Well, you look at the spell ID. So for example, for tactical destruction, what you want to do is here at the top tabs, you see one thing that is called trigger. Almost always this trigger tab will have a spell ID in it because the trigger determines which ability makes the WeakAura work, basically. So under this trigger tab, you'll just scroll down and look for a spell ID. And here, for example, the spell ID is this. So now you can go on Wowhat and just look for the spell, and then you get an explanation on what it is. I'll show you. All right, so if you look at the URL, let me just show you. So if you go to the URL at the top of the screen, it says wowhat.com/spell equals and then the number, right? And this number is the spell ID. So if you copy the spell ID, which was, let me copy this again, 406678. And now the spell will appear, magic, right? And you can do the same thing backwards. If you want to make a WeakAura for a certain ability, instead of writing the name of the spell, you can always look for the spell ID on Wowhat. It will always be up here in the URL. This will always be the ID of the spell. And you can use this for many different add-ons, for Plater, for WeakAuras, for whatever. This is the spell ID. And then it will not be triggering on other spells that look similar or whatever, right? And now we know, okay, this is a tactical destruction. Upon reaching 1 energy, Siskarn unleashes stairs, blah, 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 right? So now you know what the ability does. And now you know if you need this WeakAura or not. If you don't need it, you just delete the WeakAura. If you don't want to delete it, because you think that you might need it again later, because that happens too, right? Sometimes you're not sure about a boss, like if it's a new raid that comes out, and you're not really sure, do I need this WeakAura or not? Then what you can do, instead of deleting it, is you can just make it not load, and then you can enable it again later. And the way that works is that you just go onto the load tab here, and then you just click here on load never. So now this WeakAura will never load until I enable it again. And then I will just remove this never load tab here, and then it will be here again. So this is a way on how you can keep WeakAuras, but just disable them for now, right? All right, so that's some things about WeakAuras. I know WeakAuras are a lot more complicated than this, and there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to WeakAuras, but that's just like a general idea. You can also, when you play in Plus, there's always really good WeakAura packs you can download that Relo makes. If you go to Relo's Vago, he usually makes these like Season 2 dungeon WeakAuras, where he just has a bunch of WeakAuras for all of the dungeons combined. And usually he also has an anchor WeakAura that does the same thing as I explained earlier. One really simple thing as well that is pretty easy to learn is adding a sound effect. And some people don't know how that works. The way that works is you just go to the certain ability that you want a sound effect for. So let's say I want a sound effect for Whirling Dagger, which is an ability that the last boss in Freehold does. Then you click on the ability and you go to Actions on the top tab here and you just click on Play Sound. And then you look for a sound. Another pretty cool thing is downloading a sound pack for certain text-to-speech sounds, right? Because everyone knows the air horn, for example, right? And a lot of WeakAuras always come with these like generic sounds that you can select from here. But at some point, your brain will be like, oh my god, every single WeakAura is an air horn. It's best to have different sounds attached to different things to make sure that your brain immediately understands what it is without having to see the icon of the WeakAura. So you have a sound cue and you have an icon. Now, there's two tricks you can do with sounds. Number one, you can select the same sound for similar abilities. For example, like if you do dungeons, there's a lot of mobs that have frontals. And they're all the same, right? They all do the same thing. The front of the mob is just going to be a cone in front of the mob and you have to move away, right? So if you take every single frontal and add the same sound to that frontal, then immediately as you hear the sound, you know it's a frontal. It doesn't matter which frontal it is, you know it's a frontal. And you can do the same thing with other things. For example, let's say there's an ability where you have to spread out. Then you can attach the same sound to every ability where you have to spread. And you can always add the same sound to those same abilities, so your brain recognizes them immediately, right? Another thing you can do is use text-to-speech. So the sound literally tells you what it is. There's a lot of WeakAuras that come with sound packs. Usually the way it works is that it's a file. You download a file and you extract it into your add-on folder, and then it will pull the sound from the sound file on your computer. For example, I have this WeakAura here that tells me if I have an external on me, right? And this WeakAura works with a sound file that I downloaded, and it basically just says the name of the ability that I have, right? So if I get Ironbark, it will say Ironbark. If I get Sacrifice, it will say Sacrifice, or Pain Sup, or whatever, right? And that is really nice if it's a bunch of different things that you need to know. For example, if I get intervened by a tank, by a prot warrior, then it will say intervene, and then I know that the next ability that hits me will go on a tank. Because intervene is kind of hard to see, in my opinion. If you get bop, pretty easy to see, right? You don't necessarily need a WeakAura for it. But if a prot warrior intervenes you, I always feel like that's not super easy to see, especially if you're a melee player or if you're really close to the boss. Then it's not really obvious if a tank intervened you or not. So having this WeakAura pack is really, really nice. And using text-to-speech in general is really nice because then the voice just tells you what is happening. Like it will literally tell you what to do. Instead of having an air horn, you have a WeakAura that says spread out or stack up or intervene or whatever, right? So using that is also very nice. Another quick thing about WeakAuras before I leave it is organizing your WeakAuras, in my opinion, is also really important. So you know which ones to delete. Because sometimes your PC will be super slow if you have a lot of WeakAuras that are like 5 years old and they're pulling weird data and they're constantly in the background or whatever, and it can cause your computer to like literally like freeze up and lag. So you want to update your WeakAuras all the time, because usually when you're importing a WeakAura from an add-on creator, a WeakAura creator, then they will update the WeakAuras on Vago, and you might not know that they updated them. There's a software, it's called WeakAura Companion, and you can download it from Vago, and this is what it looks like. So you just open it on your PC, and then this works for playthrough as well, by the way. And then you just click on Fetch Updates. And then it will see if there's any WeakAuras that you currently have that were updated by the creator of the WeakAura, right? So now you fetch updates, and then you go in-game. And then, for example, here it says Dragonflight Season 2 dungeons, ready for update, right? And now you literally just click here, and it will give you this window, and it will ask you, should it update the WeakAura, or do you want to create a copy? Do you want to only update size and position? or names, actions, whatever, you can deselect some of these things if you don't want everything to be updated, and then you update, and that's it. Then you're done. Now, let's talk about boss mods. So Bigwigs or DBM or whatever you may be using for your boss mods. A lot of people install a boss mod and they just leave it there. And generally that works fine. But I do think that there's a lot of things you can do with boss mods that some people are maybe not aware of. I'm going to show you what you can do with Bigwigs. I personally don't use DBM or anything else, so I'll show you how this works, but I'm sure most boss mods have similar things. So for example, one thing I really like doing is if there's like a really important mechanic, then I personally like adding a countdown to it. Now you can do this with a WeakAuras as well. You don't need to do this with this, but it's really quick, right? So for example, let's say I'm doing Kasara and I keep dying to the frontal, like where the boss turns and spits at you, right? To stop dying to the ability, it's called Hell Beam. What I'm gonna do is I just go to this ability and I add a countdown. So now 5 seconds before the ability happens, a lady will count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then you're aware that you have to pay attention, right? So having a countdown is very nice. I personally don't like putting countdowns to multiple abilities because otherwise your brain gets confused. On one boss fight, I usually only put a countdown to one ability per phase. So whenever I hear the countdown, I know which ability is going to come up, and it's not like a random, like if I put a countdown to 3 different abilities, then the countdown starts and I don't know what it's about. So I usually like putting a countdown to only one ability per phase, so I know what it is. Another thing you can do is change the color of the bar. Because if you look at this side here, like there's like a bunch of abilities that all have the same bar, and it's kind of hard. Like if you're in the middle of a raid boss and you want to know when a certain ability comes up, you have to look over where your bars are, and you might have a small text or a small icon and you don't see it, and then the bars move around and you're just distracted. It takes a long time for you to see it, right? So what I like doing is changing the colors of some of the abilities that you think is important to know the timer off. So for example, if we go to Forgotten Experiment, okay. Let's say you want to know the timer of the deep breath. Actually, no, a better example would be the Violent Eruption. On this boss, if you're a healer or a Shadow Priest, there's a debuff in the raid, and if you dispel that debuff, it spawns an Add on the ground. And if that Add is alive while the Violent Eruption is happening, then it does a lot more damage. So if you're the person that dispels, then you want to make sure you know when the Violent Eruption is happening, right? Because if the Violent Eruption is happening in 6 seconds, then you do not want to dispel. So as a priest with Master Spell or as a healer with Magic Dispel, it's pretty important for you to know when the Violent Eruption is happening. So what I would do if I was a Shadow Priest or a healer, I would go to this ability and I would change the color of the bar. And here on bars, it says normal and emphasized. So blue is the normal color, but I can make this like pink, for example. So now this ability's bar is pink. And once it's emphasized, I also just make it pink or whatever else you want, right? So now when I'm playing this boss, I will see all of the blue bars here, except one bar will be pink. And when I look over at the timers, I will immediately see the pink timer. So I will immediately know where it is, and I can see how long it's gonna be for it, right? That is, in my opinion, very important whenever you have an ability like that you need to see in like a long time before it happens, right? Because if the ability is important to know for 5 seconds, you can just put a countdown. But if you want to know a certain ability is happening in 10 seconds, then this is very, very good to know. Then another thing you can do with Bigwigs or with boss frames in general is disabling certain bars. Usually people never disable anything, but there's certainly some things that maybe are not very interesting to you. Whenever you do a boss fight and you have like 20 different timers going down, it's very confusing and you might not even look at it. But if you do a boss and there's a bunch of mechanics that you don't necessarily need to know the cooldown of, then you can just disable them, right? Like you can literally just disable certain timers completely and then they will not show up, which in my opinion is pretty helpful, right? Because depending on which role you play, certain abilities might just not be of interest to you, at least not to have a timer for, right? If there's a frontal that the boss does, but it only hits melee players, then I personally don't necessarily need a timer for it. Because if I'm going to stand at ranged anyway, and the frontal is not going to hit me, I might as well remove that ability. All right, then one more thing I do want to talk about is nameplates. So in my opinion, the most important add-ons in general for raiding and M+ is WeakAuras, then any kind of boss mod for raiding. You can also have a boss mod for M+, by the way. Big Wix has an add-on that's called Little Wix, which is basically the same as a raid boss mod, except it's for dungeons. And I think DBM has something similar as well. And the third most important thing, in my opinion, is having proper nameplate settings, especially if you do M+. In raiding, it definitely has less of an importance, because raiding, for example, if you play a single target boss, like if you play Kasara, it doesn't matter what your nameplates look like, right? As long as you have a good target frame. But especially if you play M+, there are certain boss fights that also have a lot of ads there. And then it's also pretty important to have clean nameplates. And nameplates are usually the thing that people struggle the most with when it comes to setting them up. Now, I personally recommend Plater as a nameplate add-on, just because Plater has the most settings and has the most, like, you can get the most help with Plater, because Plater is on Vago and you can import scripts, you can import mods, you can import whole settings for it, and it's really, really nice to just have the options, right? Plater, you can make them look however you want. There's many options with Plater. It's very complicated, very similar to like WeakAuras when it comes to the complications of it. And the one thing I hate about Plater that is, in my opinion, the options are very disorganized. Like, in my opinion, it's very hard to find certain things because the way Plater is set up is a little bit complicated. But what I recommend doing, I think there's no shame to just import somebody else's Plater settings. I don't think there's a shame in that. Because Plater, like nameplates, is something that works for everyone. It's different with WeakAuras. I would not necessarily recommend to install somebody else's WeakAuras and then just leave them the way they are, right? Because WeakAuras are very like personal in a sense that it has to make sense with your role and with your spec, and it needs to make sense for you and what trinkets you're running and what talents you're running and blah, 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 right? But nameplates, in my opinion, are a little bit less personal because they're nameplates, right? Of course, there's things that you want to see for yourself, but in general, the settings when it comes to the CVAR settings, they work for many people, right? And when I say CVAR settings, World of Warcraft has nameplate settings in-game. They're actually not add-on related, okay? So Blizzard, by default, the standard Blizzard UI has nameplate settings that you can change, but there's no official, like they're not in an official like interface options. You can only access them through like typing in a script in your chat or by having an add-on that is called Advanced Interface Options. I have an add-on that is called Advanced Interface Options, and it basically gives me this thing here. Now, this looks complicated. What this is these are all just hidden options that exist in-game. Like, they are all allowed options by Blizzard. They're just not part of the interface options. But if you type in a script in the chat, then they will be changed. And this add-on just makes it easier for you to change them without needing to write in a script. That's it. So this add-on just allows you to see the options here, right? And the main reason why I use this CVAR browser here, this advanced interface option, is for nameplate settings. So if you look here, if you type in nameplate, you see all of these settings here are nameplate settings. And I don't mean the way they look, I mean functional settings. Like, there's like a million things you can set. You can set how close the nameplate is to the mobs. You can set how close the nameplates are to each other, vertically and horizontally. You can set how far up they go on your screen, how far down they go on your screen, how much they're overlapping, how much they're stacking. There's all of these options are here. Standard Blizzard settings. They don't have anything to do with an add-on. They're just there by default. Now, if you use Plater, you do have some of these options in the add-on. So you can just use a slider instead of using this. But I do recommend, if you want to play around with your nameplate settings, I do also recommend just using the CVARs and making sure that you know what they're doing. For example, you have different kinds of scales. They're pretty much self-explanatory, but there's also a description here. Top inset. The inset from the top in-screen percent that blah, 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 right? So for example, I have this on -1, which means that for me, the nameplates go outside of the screen. So if I look at these dummies here and I move my camera down, then they go out of my screen. That's a setting that I like. Doesn't mean that everyone likes this setting though, right? This is a personal thing. I personally like the nameplates to go outside of my screen, because if you don't have this, I'll show you what happens. So if I put the top inset on, right, so if I put this on 0.08, then you see what it's doing. Like when I move my camera down, this space here where my mouse is right now, it will not be used by the nameplates. So this space is effectively just, the nameplates will not go up there, right? But what happens this way is that they will all clamp up at the top. So I have stacking nameplates, not overlapping nameplates, right? But if for whatever reason, let's say I'm standing further back as a range GPS, and my camera is a little bit further down because I want to see swirlers on the ground. So now this is what the nameplates are doing, right? They are going to be stacked up because they cannot be pushed further up because I just put the setting for it, right? This is fine though. Like if you have a setting like that, it's important for you to know though that this is happening. So what do you do if this is how your nameplates look like? Well, either you change the setting the way I have it and they go out of your screen, or you just move your camera down, right? Because this is what happens if you move your camera up. There's just not enough space at the top of your screen for the nameplates to go anywhere, so they'll just clamp up. So if you're ever in an plus dungeon and this is what's happening and your nameplates do this, just be aware that you just have to move your camera down and they will spread out again and you'll see better, right? If you want the same setting as I do, then you can just do the same thing where you do put -1, right? You can do the same thing at the bottom, by the way, where nameplates either stay inside your screen at the bottom or they go off your screen. You just have to put a minus point to it then. There's other plater settings that, in my opinion, are pretty good to know. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail because there's, again, like a million things you can do. One thing that I personally think is pretty important is that if you have a lot of mobs, that you still see your most important things. So number one, you want to see the cast bar of a mob. All right, so if you go under cast bar, you can enable a test cast bar. Under here, toggle cast bar test. So now I see where my cast bar is. And then you can move your camera around a little bit to see how it looks like. So if you pull a lot of mobs, you can be like, okay, so if I pull them up like this, you can see the cast bar of this top dummy is kind of covered. I don't see it, right? So this it's like, you know, it could be better. It's like if I move my camera like this, I can see the cast bars fine. If I move like this, some of them are covered, some of them are not, you know, like you kind of have to figure out how you want to set up your nameplates just to make sure that you still see the most important casts. And you can do that by making sure there's enough space in between the nameplates, right? If you look at your nameplates, right now they're so close to each other, which technically is fine because the closer the nameplates are to each other, the more space you're going to have at the top, which is pretty important with nameplates. Technically speaking, with nameplates, you want to make sure to have as much space at the top as possible, because this space is much more important than horizontal space. Vertical space is much more important. Usually the nameplates are at the top of your screen already. Right? Because my character is here, the nameplates are not going to be behind me, right? The nameplates are always going to be more at the top of your screen. And the nameplates are not going to be spread out horizontally. They're going to be stacked vertically, right? So whenever you can somehow save space above your nameplate and below your nameplate, you want to do that, and you want to make sure they're as close as possible without covering anything, right? You don't want to have cast bars covered, you don't want to have your dots covered, or any important debuffs that you want to see. Now, one thing that I personally did with my nameplates is that I put my important dots to the side, because horizontal space, as I said, is much less important than vertical space. So you should definitely be using the left side of your nameplate, and you should also be using the right side of your nameplate for important things. You also want to make sure things are not overlapping, of course. There's something you can do with Plater that is called like a special auras or buff special, and you can enable 2 of these. Alright, so there's something called an aura frame 1. This is under buff settings. So you have aura frame 1 and aura frame 2. And you can see it on my screen right now. So my aura frame 1 is to the left. So basically, if a mob would be raging, then I would see it on the left. And then on top of the bar, I have aura frame 2. which would be something else. And you can set up what you want in each of these aura frames under buff tracking. Another thing you can do is change your cast bar icons as well. Make sure you can either remove the cast bar icon, or you can make it smaller or bigger, however you want. There's also certain WeakAuras that show like markers. For example, my aura frame 2 has markers. So this frame here, this aura frame 2, which I said is this one at the top, includes raid markers. So my raid marker is going to be here. Another really cool thing that Plater has is coloring certain mobs differently. And this is something that a lot of people do not do, even though it's very easy. If you go to NPC colors and names, right? So if you go to this tab here on Plater, you can look for a mob. Let's say you play Rogue and you play an Underot and you need to interrupt, like your job is to disrupt the maggot's frontal cast. Like, let's say that's just what you're assigned to do, right? Now, what you can do, sometimes when you do a big pull in Underot, there's a bunch of lashers and there's blood swarmers and there's maggots and there's everything just on top of each other, and you have a hard time like finding the correct nameplate, right? Now, if you recolor the nameplate to a different color, then it's so much easier for you to see, right? So you just go to Plater, you look for the maggots, fatted maggot, the Underot, and then you just select the color and you make it whatever it is. Whenever you do this with the different colors, you can also have a coloring like strategy. The same way as I talked about the sound effects earlier, you can have the same color for similar type mobs. So for example, the maggot has a frontal that needs to be disrupted, not interrupted, right? It can only be stunned or disoriented or something, right? So if you find a second mob in a different dungeon that is similar to the maggot, that also has like a cast that you need to disrupt, then you can use that color for those type of mobs, right? So let's say you make the maggot dark orange. You play a freehold afterwards and you notice, oh, there's this mob that I also need to disrupt because it does a fixate or like a frontal or whatever it may be. And then you make that, look for that mob, and you also make that mob's nameplate orange, right? So now all of the mobs that have something that you need to disrupt are orange. All of the mobs that you need to pay attention to because they have a frontal are green. All of the mobs that you need to stay away from because they explode have their blue or whatever. One more really cool WeakAuras that I can suggest for M+ specifically. All right, so there's this WeakAuras. It's called Spell CD on Nameplate, Dragonflight Season 2. I honestly don't know who made this. But what this does is it will show you the inner cooldown of important abilities. Like all of these abilities, every mob, every trash mob, every boss has an inner cooldown on an ability, right? They're not going to cast a frontal back to back to back, right? If they cast a frontal once, then they will not be able to cast a frontal again for another, let's say, 10 seconds, right? And this WeakAuras here will show you the cooldown of those abilities, and it will be attached to your nameplate. Yeah, there you go. So you see this icon here on the right? This shows the cooldown of the Blood Harvest. And now you can see the Blood Harvest is on CD. Blood Harvest is the charge, in case you didn't know. So now it shows me it cannot cast Blood Harvest, and when it's close to being ready again, it will be glowing. Right. Then one more thing I want to talk about is MDT. MDT, Mythic Dungeon Tools, made by Nagi. So this tool, I think it speaks for itself, but a lot of people are not like really utilizing it that well, I guess. And a lot of people are not playing around with it. Now, I personally think if you play a lot of M+, I think playing around with MDT helps a lot to just understand the route better. And I know that most people that are pugging are completely just relying on the tank to post a route, and then they just do whatever the tank says. Like they don't even click on the route, they just follow the tank and do what the tank does, which works usually, right? But I personally think that if you want to be a better M+ player, then understanding the routes better and understanding how much percentage things give is pretty important, because sometimes tanks don't know best. Like, I know that the tanks are the ones that need to know the route the best, and because they need to survive it, but sometimes they have like a really weird route that they imported from somebody else from Tyrannical week, and now it's Fortified week, and the pulls that they're doing just make no sense, right? So if you understand MT, you understand routing a little bit better, then you can help out with routes, and you can change things around and suggest things as well, because there are certain routes that are just a lot more efficient than others, right? The way MDT works is like, it's pretty straightforward. Like it shows you the dungeon on a map and it shows you where the mobs are. Now, of course, some of these mobs are patrolling and they're just stationary here, right? So it will, like for example, this matron here patrols back and forth. The way you see that is by actually mouse overing it, right? So now when I mouse over this matron, I can see the patrol path, right? You can see it goes down, up and down. So that is something that you can see when you mouse over them, which is pretty nice as well. Like if you don't know how a patrol walks, then you can do the mouse over thing. Like here, for example, this Defiler patrols in this like kind of square, right? And you see if a map patrols, if it has this blue outline. So you see how this Defiler doesn't have a blue outline and this Defiler does. It's because this Defiler patrols and this doesn't. So this Corruptor patrols as well. You can see it has the blue outline and this Corruptor does not patrol, right? So the blue outline indicates that it's patrolling. If you click on one mob, you see what it's linked to as well, which is pretty important, right? So for example, if I click on this one tick here, it selects all of the ticks because they're connected, right? If they're not connected, if something isn't connected, then selecting one will not select anything else. So for example, this matron here is not connected to any other pack. So if I click on it, you can see I can pull this by itself. Same goes for this maggot here. I can pull this by itself. So if I'm not sure about a pack being like all 4 mobs or just one or whatever, then you can just go to MDT, click on a mob and see, okay, these 4 mobs, they come together, right? Now, another thing is that you can see the enemy forces and the percentage. A lot of people look at percentage rather than enemy forces when it comes to M+. I personally recommend to look at enemy forces instead of percentage. Just because it's easier. Because the percentages are decimal numbers. For example, this Headhunter gives 1.56%. That is hard to remember, right? But the amount of enemy forces that this Headhunter gives is 5. And in my opinion, remembering 5 is a lot easier than remembering 1.56%, right? So if you install a WeakAuras that shows enemy forces as a number instead of a percent, because I know the standard Blizzard UI only shows percentage, but if you have a WeakAuras, for example, Reload's Timer WeakAuras and Plus WeakAuras, then you will see the actual enemy forces as a number and not as a percent. So this WeakAuras is literally called a Plus Timer. You can set this up the way you want. You can make the background different, you can make the colors different, you can change the way the percentage is displayed, the enemy forces is displayed, and so on and so on. And I personally just think changing your brain to think about enemy forces as a number is easier than looking at things as percentages, right? Because sometimes you do a route and there's only 2 more mobs that you can do that are in front of the last boss. Now you have to figure out how much percent do we need before we can move on, right? And if you think in percentages instead of enemy forces, then you have to remember these like super weird numbers where it's like, oh, we need 7.34% before we move on or whatever. If you look at enemy forces, then you would just know, okay, the last 2 mobs give 10 enemy forces. We're gonna need, like if the dungeon needs 100 enemy forces, then you're gonna need 90. So changing your brain or looking at enemy forces instead of percentages is usually a lot easier. But as I said, MDT displays both. Now here you have the enemy forces counter. You can see like if you select the mobs, then it will count up. So now, for example, I have exactly 100%. All of the trash that is selected here in this route is 320 out of 320 enemy forces, so perfect percentage. And you can play around with this, right? You can be like, okay, so what if we pull these ticks here at the start? So now we have 5 extra enemy forces that we could skip somehow. This maggot gives 5 forces, right? So now we could decide, okay, maybe we skip this maggot somehow and we just pull the ticks instead. And then you can just play around like this. You can be like, okay, so what if we skip these 2 lashers? Okay, so now I'm missing 8 enemy forces. Where do we get those enemy forces from? And then you see, okay, well, this grotesque horror gives 7. Okay, so this is not enough, right? So now we're missing 1 enemy force. Now this corruptor gives 10. All right, so now we would have enough, technically. But is it worth it to play a corruptor instead of 2 lashers? Probably not, right? So you can like think back and forth on how you're gonna do the routing, which mobs you're pulling. These mobs patrol, so it might be bad to pull them. And you can just see the different You can see the different HP levels, and you can see the different enemy forces it gives, and then you can just play around like this to make sure that you reach 100% in the end. You can even have live sessions as well. If you press live sessions, it will share a link in the group, and then you can work together with your group on the same MDT. So if you do a live session and somebody else opens my route and I draw this, then the other person will see this arrow that I just drew, right? And then you can think about routes together. You can import routes, you can export routes. Then one more add-on in my opinion, or one more add-on that I think is pretty useful in M+ in general is OmniCD. OmniCD is an add-on that shows group cooldowns and mainly group cooldowns. So basically what it does, you can enable it for different things. It's mainly important for dungeons, for raiding, it's kind of whatever. But what you can do is you can enable people's interrupt cooldown. For example, here, I can see my solar beam right now. If there was other people in my group, I would see their wind shear, I would see their pummel, their whatever. And this is pretty important because you know, okay, no one else is an interrupt ready, so I have to interrupt, right? So it's pretty important to keep track of this. You can also track other things with OmniCD. You can track people's AoE CC, for example. Like if you think it's important to see somebody's Chaos Nova, somebody's Leg Sweep, Shadow Fury, you know, or you can even select certain raid cooldowns if you want. If you want to see Tranquility cooldown, AM cooldown, Sacrifice, whatever it may be. You can set all of this up here under spells. You see all of these, like you can select whatever you want to see. Then you can have this as a bar. The way I have the interrupts here is a bar, but you can also have a display under your player frame. So my group frame is grid 2, and this works for every group frame, no matter what you use. If you use standard Blizzard UI or Voodoo or Healbot or whatever it may be that you're using as a group frame, you can attach OmniCD to your group frame and you can select which things you want to show. Like for example, for Druids, I selected to show me Barkskin and Renewal. So now I see if I use Renewal, then you can see it's on cooldown. And I see this for every person in the group, depending on what I selected. So for mages, for example, I want to track their combustion. So I select combustion. If I want to see ice block as well, or cauterize, or whatever you want to see it, then you can select it as well. This is mainly for offensive cooldowns here, but they're all like in whatever category, right? So these are all offensive cooldowns. You can also track defensive cooldowns, like cold snap all the time, great invisibility, whatever you want to select, you can select here, and then it will be tracked underneath the player. Whatever you think is important, whatever you need to know. If you're a healer, you probably want to see the defensives, mainly, right? If you play healer, you want to see Barkskin Renewal, Health Pod, Health Zone, Dark Pact, whatever it may be that you want to see, right? But if you're a damage dealer, it might be important for you to see their offensive cooldowns. So if I play a damage dealer, I want to see, does my Shadow Priest have PI ready soon? Is my Hunter gonna pop off soon? And I personally think that's very useful to set up, so you get a little bit of an overview of the other people in your group.